Hello, it's John Heaton, and I was planning to review the new Ringo Starr album today, but I looked for it in Budapest in vain today. It just came out on Friday and it's only Sunday, so it's going to take a while to get here. I'll probably pick it up in London. I'm in London next week. Just had a quick listen to it on Spotify. Little bit too early to pass judgment, so I'll wait and do a full review. But just in the meantime, I thought I'd review this album, because this kind of sums up Ringo's material on EMI before he left for Polydor in '76. And it's a pretty short album, so it's not very satisfying from a length point of view. But I think on the whole it's pretty good track selection. There's a couple of omissions which I will point out, but here's the packaging, and this is actually quite a rare album. I don't really see this in second-hand record shops at all, really, whereas I see Goodnight Vienna and the Ringo album and Rote Graveur quite a lot, and even Bad Boy, but I don't often see this one, and I'm not quite sure why. I don't think it's sold by the bucket load, but they must have pressed a few, because Ringo was still fairly big commercial name at the time, and he'd had hit singles within a year of this album coming out, so it wasn't as if it was released after his peak or anything. A little quote here: "You don't have to be first, but make sure you're not last. A local gynecologist." And what is the most interesting thing of this album for me, which I'll come to, these are the pictures. Quite nice camera roll pictures of Ringo there, and the lyrics, always nice to have. I think it's the first time fans had been given the lyrics to some of the singles, early 1970 and Don't Come Easy, Back Off Boogaloo. And then, this is the greatest thing about this album in my opinion, it's on the Red Apple. I say the Red Apple. I think it's the only Red Apple in existence. George had obviously come out with the Orange Apple on All Things Must Pass. Ringo himself had come out with the Blue Apple on his Back Off Boogaloo single. All four of them had had solo albums and singles on the Green Apple, and John had used the White Apple on Plastic Ono Band. So, but this is the only... Oh, there is one other Red Apple, I just remembered. The US copy of Let It Be is on the Red Apple. So not the first. But I think I'm right in saying this is the last album to be released on the Apple label, certainly in the first batch up until 76 when Apple closed down, and then later on they did release the Beatles at the BBC on Apple, both volumes of that, but this was the last album of the first era of Apple, shall we say. And there's a single, they released a double A-sided single, Oh My My and No No Song. Oh My My had already been a single in the US and done pretty well, I think, backed with Step Lightly. And then, but this double A-sided single, it didn't do well in the charts, but it's a collector's item, and I'm being on the lookout for it, because I think that was more or less the last single on Apple. The other one I'm looking for is George's This Guitar Can't Keep From Crying, which was another late single on Apple. So those two would be very nice to find. I'll have a look for them in London when I'm there next week. So this album, the tracks that he picks are fairly obvious. Your 16 opens with open side 1, No No Song from Goodnight Vienna is the second track. Don't Come Easy, the big hit single from '71, which I think got to number 2 and outsold the singles from the other Beatles released at the same time, which is quite remarkable, those singles being Another Day from Paul, Power to the People from John, and Bangladesh from George. Obviously it didn't outsell My Sweet Lord, which had been released earlier in that year, or at the end of '70. Photograph. It's another big hit single for Ringo, and this song is credited to Starkey and Harrison. So I think George, you can feel his influence on the melody here. Very nice job, and Back Off Boogaloo, good to have this on an album. Good to have those two singles on an album, really. It's one of the advantages of this album. Back Off Boogaloo, a great single from 1972, which got to number 2 in the charts. So at the time, Ringo was kind of outselling Paul in the singles charts, which is, in England anyway, quite extraordinary. Only You opened side 2, which is the cover version from Goodnight Vienna, where Lennon is playing acoustic guitar and singing backing vocals from Harry Nilsson. Beaucoups of Blues, the title track of that 1970 country album, which is a brilliant genre effort from Ringo. And that is a worthy inclusion here. Oh My My from the Ringo album. And then very nice to have the B-side early 1970, the B-side of It Don't Come Easy, with these great words about the other 3 Beatles. So it starts off singing about Paul lives on a farm, got plenty of charm, beep beep. He's got no cows, but he's sure got a whole lot of sheep. Brand new wife and a family. And when he comes to town, I wonder if he'll play with me. And a similar verse about George and John and then George. The difference being with George, he has a 40-acre house he doesn't see because he's always in town playing for you with me. So I think relations with George and John were a little bit more cordial, should we say, than the relations with Paul at the time. But happy to say they made it up within a couple of years of that song coming out in '71. In fact, they met socially at Mick Jagger's wedding in France, and that was the first time they'd seen each other socially since the split. So maybe some things were mended in the relationship, or started to mend then. But at the time, it was fairly traumatic between them, with all the court case, trying to dissolve the partnership, Paul and the other 3 against him. So despite that, Ringo comes out with this track, which is very open-hearted and begs for reconciliation, really. Very nice to see. Then the album finishes with John's song from the Ringo album, I'm the Greatest, which is about the closest that the Beatles got to a reunion, because John is on piano, singing backing vocals, George is on guitar, and Ringo is on drums and singing. And I think they say that Paul would have been there if he could get a visa, but at the time he was not allowed into the US because of narcotics offences. This is pretty damn close to a reunion, and that same album Paul did contribute some songs on that Ringo album, one song, and played on another. So again, Ringo being the bridge over troubled water, as he usually was and is. Don't think many of them really fell out with him for very long. So that's Blast From Your Past, a very worthy compilation and a nice summation of the Apple years for Ringo. Thank you for watching. See you next time.